Stanley Crossick, good morning. You are the founding chair of the European Policy Center, and you accepted this interview to talk about the Lisbon Treaty, multilateralism, and the New World Order. So my first question to you would be, in the last decade, the first decade of the millennium, we have seen two unprecedented crises burst, climate change and the economy. That pushed for new models of governance. Do you think those two crises have created a new world order?
I would say they've created a new world disorder, and the question is, can we now bring a new order into the world, taking into account the changed circumstances in the last 10, 20 years?
To what extent do you think this new world order will be a multilateral order?
Well, I don't want to get into semantics about multipolarism or multilateralism. What is clear is we're at the end of the era of hegemony. If you look at China, that is perhaps the most important of the growing powers, they would not be seeking a hegemonious role. That's not in their spirit. Whether they talk about multipolarity or multilateralism, we're talking essentially about multilateralism, because everybody now accepts that no country, not even the United States, can go it alone. We have to work together. Therefore, it will be multilateral. The real difficulty, however, is whether the old powers are going to cling to their current representation and direction of international bodies, which is now completely out of keeping with today's world.
So in terms of structures, we have heard about the G2, the G20, the G8 plus 5. What do you think, what you make of that, and what do you think will be the right structure? We have seen in Copenhagen, we have a UN-led negotiation with 192 countries. So what structure really do you think would be useful?
Well, G2 is a figment of the imagination of American academics. It's not been a policy put forward by the Obama administration, and Beijing has absolutely rejected it. It is not in the Chinese thinking, because if you do a G2 with America, you make enemies with others. That's not its idea. So forget G2 and forget G3. It's pretty obvious that the only real body around is G20. That in many ways too big. But then if G20 was the only G body, maybe this could be institutionalized, and there should be a more effective structure of operating. But I can see G2 as the only possible vehicle. That doesn't mean to say we don't reform United Nations, IMF, World Bank, etc. But in terms of political decision making, it's going to have to be the G20, because you'll never get the Security Council in a form you want it. And again, you have the problem of the veto, because underneath all this, and this is where the problem of true multilateralism arises, is the issue of sovereignty. Europe has gone multilateral by pooling sovereignty. There are two countries in the world, China and the United States, who absolutely refuse, who find sovereignty as an absolute. Now, in fact, this is somewhat misguided, because they both are in the WTO, so they have pooled sovereignty. But there's something so fundamental, partly due to their history, partly due to their culture, so that we can't get true multilateralism without pooling sovereignty. So we've always got that block to overcome.
But both the US and China have changed tremendously in the last years or so. What will it take for them to pull sovereignty, you think? Will there be a way for them to realize that maybe they need to be ambitious enough to pull that sovereignty?
Well, America hasn't changed. The leadership of America has changed, but Obama is just as much a European exceptionalist as Bush is. Obama is a Clinton multilateralist, which means you do everything possible to involve others, but you reserve the right to go it alone if you can't get it agreed. That's not true multilateralism. There's no change in America. China, there is no change in this absolute approach to sovereignty and interfering in domestic politics. No change at all. So both countries have changed in many ways, but not in this fundamental respect.
How does the EU fit in this?
Well, I'm afraid at the moment the EU is sorely needed. If you travel around the world, you'll find that China, India and other countries would love the EU to take a lead. The EU is nowhere, as we saw in Copenhagen. So the big question is, will the EU get its act together? There is a seat at the top table for it, but will it be capable of occupying it? That's the big question.
Do you think the Lisbon Treaty can help?
Oh yes, the Lisbon Treaty puts the mechanisms in place to change this approach and to work towards a single voice, not necessarily a common voice. You can have a single voice, which doesn't mean that you have to agree on every detail, but speaking together. But whether this will be achieved is not dependent on an efficient mechanism. It's dependent upon the will and, if I may say so, the ego of the member state leaders. And with all due respect to the leaders, I won't name them, but they're not a kind of bunch of leaders that give you much confidence, with certain exceptions. So it's all in place, but I would go one stage further and say that there's too much expected of Lisbon from day one. It needs 5 years to get the infrastructure in place before we see whether Lisbon will be successful. Common commercial policy wasn't built in 5 years. It took decades. Foreign policy would take even longer. So we have to be patient. But whether we'll overcome this, who knows? That's the big question. But the world needs it, not just Europe.